This is now the training session presented by two people coming from Lancaster as well. I introduce Kathy Gartner and Professor Philippe Ternouth, which will explain us and give us a guide, especially for SMEs, to good working with the universities.
We fully realize that we are between your lunch and a Friday afternoon in Paris. So we're very conscious of the time. We will try to finish by 1 o'clock as we are timetabled. And we would like to make this a little bit interactive because I think we've heard a great deal of information coming at you. We'd like some kind of feedback. And we're going to do a double-hander. We're actually partners in life as well as standing here today. So if you see us interacting, don't worry, it's normal. First of all, I wasn't expecting that, but it is France. Okay. What I'd like to do is to really understand how many folks in here who are from companies are actively working with universities. Would you like to put up your hand? Okay. And how many of the university folks in here are actually working with small companies? Okay, so it's a bit more one way than the other. And I suppose, are there intermediaries in here who try to bridge between those two? Oh, you have my sympathies. I've been there. I've been there for a long time.
We both have. Are there any companies here not working with universities?
Not too many.
Not too many.
Okay. Okay. So that helps us actually answer the question, where should we start? And I'm very conscious that we have a very mixed audience today, so forgive us if we're not quite hitting this right, but we wanted to understand who was in the audience. So really what we're going to do today is set a bit of the scene, largely from a UK perspective. We will maybe put out some questions to you. We want to look at some of the challenges that small companies in particular face when beginning and continuing to work with universities. We want to set out some of the opportunities and benefits that are there. And then Phil will take on some of the programs and experiences he's had with knowledge exchange, knowledge transfer in Europe and more broadly across the world. So what has been really interesting, I think, is that this sits in the context of what everyone is talking about, developing the knowledge economy. If you, like me, have listened to the news about austerity and challenge and the bricks racing forward in economic development, we all know that we, in countries such as the UK, France, Germany, Italy, have a bit of a challenge on our hands. And innovation is one of those words that is around, which seems to be used to come to the rescue. So how do we innovate? Lots of different ways is the answer. But we tend to look at some of the models that were around, and one of the critical models that has influenced so much of this thinking is the fact that Stanford University, way back when, actually worked to create a really vibrant innovation system in Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley has become the kind of icon of innovative areas where companies, small companies can start, can get finance, can work with universities and so on. The challenge, of course, is that we now have silicon everything around the world. I think at the last count there were 105 places called Silicon something. Everything from Silicon Glen in my homeland of Scotland to the latest one in London, which is Silicon Roundabout. Not very inspiring, but however, apparently if you put silicon in front of it, that creates inspiration. The challenge really is, for all of us, that there is only one Silicon Valley. And the system and the connections and the network and the finance and the attitudes and everything that actually exists in Silicon Valley is very difficult to replicate because it's within that culture. So what we have to do is to find ways to work together within the ways that we work, within our context. There's no point in us trying to actually be the next Silicon Valley. We're not like that Silicon Valley. But I know that France itself, I've been listening to what's happening here. There's a lot of investment going in about trying to bring the universities much more into economic development. President Sarkozy, I think, has invested or plans to invest quite a large amount of money in this area. And there are, of course, existing, we heard a company from Buckley. There are existing clusters where the encouragement between companies and universities is actually quite strong. I'm not going to go into those in a great lot of detail. But I really want to get to why is it of benefit to companies and why is it of benefit to universities to work together? And here are some of the reasons up here. But we've actually seen those reasons today. Sitting through the presentations, I've been hugely struck by actually the complementarities that we've had from the presentations between our academic colleagues and our company colleagues. And it's quite striking when you sit back and listen. The long-term views are coming from the universities, the blue skies thinking, the long-term research which is going on to understand the implications of new technologies such as nano, such as what is happening in pollutants. Powerful analysis. A lot of the companies have been asking, how can we help? How can we get help with our analysis? And from the companies, we've heard, these are the markets, very different languages. It's been quite striking, actually, to just sit back and listen to the different perceptions. And if you can put them together, you can really get a win. However, there are those different languages. There are those different challenges. And sometimes breaking down those barriers is quite challenging. I want to give you a little bit of time to read some slides from a study that was done in the UK by the Design Council, which basically looked at these barriers and drew out some of the things that universities say about companies and some of the things that company people think about universities. And I'll just put these up and let you read them for a little bit to see if they ring true. I particularly liked the last one. I thought students had short hair these days, but never mind. So a very kind of stereotypical view from a company perspective of what the challenges are of working with universities. And then from a university perspective, your companies don't get away with it all, you know. Here's a kind of stereotypical view about what university folks think about companies. So, does any of this ring true? No? Yeah.
It is hugely variable. It also happens, I believe, it's also, I believe, very much a preconception. It's a wrong perception in many cases. These stereotypes don't actually, they dissolve once you actually get to grips with individual cases.
Yeah, and for many people, actually, these stereotypes can be quite off-putting. Now, we didn't have a great number of companies who've not experienced working with universities here, and I think from what I've sat through, we're actually talking to quite an experienced audience. But in many cases, small companies really are concerned about what would a university offer them. And again, another study from the UK, I apologise, these are all coming from the UK. We get obsessed about this in the UK, and we have been for a number of years. Actually, there is quite a high proportion of companies, those companies that don't work with universities, they're actually just unaware of the potential that might actually revert to them if they were able to break through the barriers, if they were able to find the right door, if they were able to find the right person, and if they're able to actually work in that context. So quite interesting about why the companies in the UK were not working with universities. But I think what companies want to say, what's in it for me? What benefit can I have? And here are some of the big things that we're just going to run through very quickly about some of the work that we've done to show where companies have really benefited from working for universities. And we'll go through some of these things in a bit more detail. I'm going to hand to Phil because this is a 4-country study that we did, Canada, the USA, UK, and Japan. And here are some of the results from that, over 100 companies engaged.
We've now actually done, this is actually the results of a study of about 100 companies in the UK, the US, Canada, and Japan. About half of the companies studied are small and medium-sized enterprises. So it is quite relevant. These findings are quite relevant. The outset of the study was to try and find out whether or not the so-called technology transfer paradigm, in other words, that the main mode of interaction between universities and companies was the patenting and licensing of technology, the patenting of university inventions, and then passing them in a linear fashion to companies. Actually, we found in some preliminary work that the main mode of activity was collaboration, some form of collaboration, people working together. And that there are lots of reasons for this, and a lot of our subsequent work has been about finding out why that is the case and what the precedents of successful relationships are, over what kind of path do they develop and why. Now you can see here that by far and away the main mode of interaction is some form of people working together. It isn't simply about the licensing of technology. In many cases where there's technology created in collaboration, it is licensed. But the main mode of activity was actually the people working together, typically in very successful cases sharing the same bench. That obviously has demands on small companies who are limited in the number of staff that they might be able to put onto a project like that. But one of the programs I'm going to talk about later on, the Knowledge Transfer Partnership Program, actually provides that organic resource for the companies. Yeah. Hit the button. Okay. So now we're actually looking at the type of benefit, the type of impact on the company's value chain. Where did the company appreciate the benefit? How was the benefit realized inside the company? And again, the technology transfer paradigm says that the main mode of benefit is by the incorporation of technology into a new product. Now, we've only actually got 20% of the cases here, of now over 100 cases, where the result of the collaboration was purely technology into product. In many cases, it is some form of change in business process, a change in the mode of product development, a change of technology used to develop products, or some form of business process redesign. Even in the case of technology into product, most of those came through research collaborations, not pure licensing.
Thanks. I kind of come back to the Silicon Valley paradigm. When the UK began to push, and for those who are thinking about this in France, it might be interesting to go back into the late 90s, when the UK really began to push this approach, it was very much convinced that that 20% was it. That was what actually had to be driven through to create a vibrant, innovative knowledge economy working between universities and companies. And what I think we've come to grips with over a period of time in the UK is that was a kind of based on technological silicon, chips, and biotech at the time, and doesn't necessarily apply now, particularly when we're working in a much more open innovation system. And we'll come to that in a moment about what universities can help smaller companies link up with some of the larger companies who actually look to the smaller companies for innovative drive and bringing new products to market. Why? Another study in the UK, this is by Nesta, has actually shown that those companies which are most innovative do work with universities. And the critical message for any policymakers is that those companies which are innovating are creating jobs at a higher rate than those who are not. So between 2002 and 2008 in the UK, the 6%, the vital 6% as this report is called, that 6% of companies that were innovating into product were actually created 54%, over half of all the new jobs that were created in the UK. This is quite astounding. And that these were not the typical startups. So it wasn't licensing into a startup to create brand new jobs. These were companies that were already growing, but which were around 5 years old. And the innovation drives growth figures that come out of this is quite compelling. Over 4% of employment growth in those innovative companies compared to 2% in non-innovating companies, 10% of sales growth compared with just under 6% in non-innovating. So if you are like us in the UK, looking to see where we go next, this is quite a critical area. And the linkage with universities can really help these innovative companies. One of the most frequent links between companies and universities, of course, are students and young people who either work in terms of placements, but actually go to work in companies. And I have an old, she is quite old now, but she wouldn't like me saying she was old, a colleague, a very long-standing colleague, who was head of technology licensing at MIT, who always said that the best form of knowledge exchange, knowledge transfer, is on a pair of feet. So actually taking people from a university into a company is really, really valuable. So access to talent, really critical, and possibly one of the easiest ways for small companies to begin to interact with universities. And we'll go on to this a little bit, but this is an example, again from Lancaster, really how the management school has really worked incredibly hard in working through programs with small, medium-sized companies to build up student consultancy projects. This is not about a student going in for just a few weeks, but it's actually looking at the company's needs and creating a team of students who will go in and actually work in that company on those company problems and be guided by an academic supervisor and actually deliver in terms of the company's needs and the company's wishes. So really bringing into small companies resources and skills they may not have, expertise they may not have, market intelligence, bringing that foresighting, bringing that long-term thinking from young people. And if you're in a creative and digital sector, what we hear from those companies is, actually, we want young people in because those are the ones who really know where the leading edge of technology is. So, very important area. We've seen it time and again this morning, the potential business benefits from the research. That blue skies thinking can really actually challenge some of the market pull in companies. And again, we've seen some examples about taking the long view. I can't remember now who was presenting, but the Royal Navy one was a key example of how a university can stand back. Can stand back and really analyse the problem and then dig down into it and actually come up with the right answer rather than necessarily.
Can I say something first?
Oh,
yeah, please, thank you. One of the really interesting things about these competitive advantages, these are competitive advantages of a university as a knowledge source. And one of the interesting things about them is that they all stem from the academic agenda. They actually arise from a desire for objectivity and seeking after knowledge and its publication. And that actually often runs counter to what one might call received wisdom about a university having to pretend to have the same values as a business. These advantages come from the academic agenda.
So, if we go back to the barriers, we go back to the preconceptions and stereotypes, how can you make this relationship work better? And you know, through the research that's been done over a number of years, really looking at the interaction between companies and universities, we've begun to actually realize that this mismatch of expectations can get us off to the wrong beginning and a wrong relationship. So when you really want to make it work, in a company, it's not all about you. It's not all about what you want to do and want to get out to the market. You have to understand that the university, the researchers, are driven by an academic imperative, they're driven by a publishing imperative, and they're driven by their own academic curiosity and interest, as Philip's just said. I think it's important that it's a shared agenda. And one of the big things that we've actually, one of the big things that we've actually found through this long-term research is that companies who come in and expect an instant answer don't necessarily get the greatest value. And it's not good to just expect a report, but the company has to dedicate a resource and an intent to take up those findings and actually embed them in the company. And one of the programs we'll talk about really makes that happen. What you shouldn't, what you shouldn't do is to expect the company to, expect the university to just do the analysis. Again, one of the presenters this morning, Professor Loso, excuse my getting your name wrong, you said you don't do standard analysis, you leave that to a company down the road. I paraphrase. But in a sense, it's a wrong expectation unless you're just buying a piece of consultancy. It's the wrong expectation that you will get the greatest value from a university by just asking for a short-term piece of work. And we've listened very much this morning to the knowledge domain as you're focused on eco-toxicity. One of the critical things we've found through our research with companies is that they tend to look at a university through their own discipline domain. So if they're a digital company, they go to the computing science. If they're an environmental company, they go to the environmental researchers. However, there is a lot of knowledge, benefit, and gain to be had by thinking more widely what a university can actually offer. So coming from a business school, how can the business school actually also help you to grow your business, to help you develop your markets, undertake market research, and so on. I had a conversation with the R&D director of Unilever recently, who actually said he'd brought in some design students and was absolutely loving the result that was coming out. Now, Unilever and design students wouldn't necessarily put them in the same box immediately, but that multidisciplinary, cross-university approach can be really, really valuable for companies. Okay. I'm speaking to very few people who are not working with universities, but how do you get into a university? One of the major complaints often is, I don't know which door to go through. Universities are big places. They don't have a come in here sticker on the front door. How do you find the right contacts? So for companies, events such as this, where you can network with universities, where you can find out what is going on, are really valuable. And universities are always having these type of events, seminars, conferences, and so on. And critically, if you know somebody in a university, and they're maybe not exactly the right person to give the answer, use your networks. Because frequently, if they don't know the answer, they will know someone who can answer it. And the website, of course. Conscious of time. I'm going to hand over to Phil.
Which is the button?
Just forward.
That one there?
Yeah.
Okay. This is one of the points that Kathy made is that it takes experience to get the best out of working with a university. Experience and resources. Now, what I've got here, and putting those two together, because there are certain things you have to do. You know, you have to expect to put in time and effort in working out what the project's going to look like. You're going to have to put in time and effort to embed the results, to localize the results, translate them into a way that matches your company's products or services. The ability to do that, to actually engage with an outside knowledge source, is something we refer to as absorptive capacity, something that a number of us, Helen Fogg, you can stand up, Helen, has been working on as well. So as a proxy for absorptive capacity, we've got the amount of experience of working with the university, going from low to high. There are different forms of supported schemes in the UK which are tailored or best matched to companies at different points in their experience curve. So here we've actually got a variety of them, going from innovation vouchers that were useful in developing a relationship, maybe classifying, categorizing a problem in the early stages of a relationship, running through a number of supported programs. I'm going to talk more about the knowledge transfer partnerships in a while, going up to the high-end sponsored collaborative long-term research programs, such as you might find, for example, between Pfizer, GSK, AstraZeneca, and the Protein Phosphorylation Centre at the University of Dundee. Very long-term. And each appropriate for different types of activity, different types of change in the company. And all of those can be supported by public funding in some way. The other thing, of course, you can get out of a university is the access to specialised facilities and equipment. That may be very, very early on test equipment, but then the question arises, how do you best use the results of that test? There's a follow-on there. What does it mean for changes in your product or services? Is Sue here? No, she's bending down at the moment. Can you stand up, please, Sue? Can you say something? I'm actually not going to steal your thunder here. You're the director of LEAD, so you say something about how it, if you will, how it develops the leadership of companies and the ability to innovate.
Yeah, so at Lancaster we run a leadership and management programme which is designed for any sector of SME, really to instill the skills that are needed to grow companies. So we don't expect that small businesses have the necessary management and leadership skills to know how to grow. So those staff development and new markets, all those things that you'd expect a leadership role to take. So we work across the Northwest with small companies on a 10-month basis to really drive the leadership of those businesses forwards, and we're seeing phenomenal results. We've been working now on this programme LEAD for the last 8 years, and it's been successful year in, year out about growing companies, giving them the skills really, and also helping them to move, helping the leader of the company move from that technical capacity to becoming and recognising the leadership that's needed to drive and grow skills in the company.
Thanks very much indeed, Stan. I think you're migrating it to London as well, aren't you? Any chance you could sort of avoid stopping and come all the way to Paris instead? Okay, I'm going to say something about knowledge transfer partnerships. Has anyone? I guess most of the people from the UK have heard of these. I'll say a little about how they work. What they do basically is take a young, very well qualified graduate, typically fewer than 5 years out of university, in some cases already with a higher degree, such as a PhD. That person is recruited into a partnership, an already formed partnership between a university and a company. There are support services available to broker those relationships and help them to co-formulate the projects. I used to be one of those support services. You get individuals who actually try and translate between the university and the business and work out what the project's going to look like, known as knowledge transfer advisors. And there are about 30 of them in the UK. The young graduate is then recruited into the company by the university. They actually become an employee of the university, but are based full-time within the company. They work with the company staff as if they were a member of the company staff, except that usually they tend to work to pretty senior management while they're doing it. So it's very, very challenging for them, and it's a great way of growing a young graduate. Over 70% of them actually stay with the companies when the scheme's complete, when the project's complete, and become a permanent member of the company staff. Usually, very often in a small company, at quite a senior level. I'm actually working on a project for the Technology Strategy Board, which runs the programme at the moment, to try and explain to them why it works so well with SMEs, because that's the question they're asking, the research councils are asking. And partly it's because they bridge this absorptive capacity gap. They provide the pair of hands in the company that actually is going to localise the university research into the company, and they are supervised for half a day a week in the company by the academic supervisor, by the partner. So the academic doesn't go into the company. The academic visits the company for half a day a week and works with the associate who is working on that project full time. So the company gets a resource that is dedicated to innovation within that company and working with the company staff to help those staff embed the results of the project within the product or services. It's been very, very successful. It's been running now for well over 30 years and has produced some quite spectacular returns on investment in individual companies. It's being internationalised as well. I've actually been running a programme for the University of Salford, which is actually developing a programme, now in its second pilot, which is European Union funded, within the Czech Republic based on exactly the same principles. Those principles are transferable. They were distilled down and taken into 4 or 5 countries in Africa, and I carried out the evaluation of that. So we've seen it working, for example, in the Czech Republic on the generation of electricity from wastewater, and in Kenya in the use of cocoa husks in the drying of tiles and roof tiles and flooring tiles. And in that particular case, improving the productivity of the company by over 60% and reducing its lead time for orders from 10 weeks to 0, being able to deliver from manufacture to order. A number of different aspects of this have gone international. So, for example, we put together a marketing course which very similar to those results, which reshaped the approach to technology marketing for the Association of University Technology Managers, which we developed with a colleague from the University of Florida, actually one of the few people I've ever met in a university tech transfer office that was sales and marketing trained. So it wasn't an accident that we managed to do that. And Universitas 21, I was once privileged to spend 3 weeks going around the world visiting 16 different universities within Universitas 21 to try and put together commercial collaborations because they each had access to different markets. One of the results that I found out recently, because these things take time, was a collaboration between an academic from the University of Auckland and Arup on a new system for recharging batteries without actually having to plug buses in. An induction process that sits a bus with its battery above a coil to charge it effectively through the ground. I didn't believe it at the time, but it's now actually coming into industrialization. One of the reasons that takes time and effort to put together collaborations and why we need to set expectations correctly is this path dependency. First of all, we've actually got to meet the right academic, and there are ways of stimulating that, and the right company. There are ways of stimulating that, been used by DARPA in the US, by EADS actually in the UK. I don't know if they've brought that to France yet. But it's about actually getting people to recognize that they have an opportunity to work together to solve a business problem. Why do we need to do that? I'll give you an example from Salford, if I may. I was asked by a professor to evaluate a proof of concept project. He said he wanted to elucidate the physics that underpinned the formation of gaseous droplets, or droplets in gaseous suspension. Actually, what he really wanted to do, but didn't know how to word the language, was develop a robust design tool for an aerosol. And just to give you an example of looking at the problem, same issue, but with different languages, not necessarily recognizing there's an opportunity there to work together. So we need to do that, first of all. We then need to co-formulate, work together to formulate the project. Why? Because the person working in the university does not necessarily understand the detail of how his or her research is going to aid your products or services. So we actually need to localize and embed, create a knowledge asset that can be used over and over again by the company, usually by actually changing the level of understanding of the company staff. And having done that, we've actually then got an embedded capability within the company, so the impact becomes sustainable. It's worthwhile saying, by the way, that knowledge transfer partnerships work equally well with high-tech and low-tech companies, and particularly with high-tech companies who are more likely to respect the value of a university, where the knowledge that's being transferred is, if you like, adjacent to their own knowledge. It's complementary to their own knowledge, but it's knowledge which they don't have. So, for example, smart holograms in Cambridge, a company working on security devices, used a KTP, whereas they managed perfectly well normal collaborations in biosensors with the University of Cambridge, embarked on a knowledge transfer partnership in the area of bromine chemistry because they didn't have the organic resource themselves to understand the bromine chemistry. Then by embarking on a project like that, which embeds the resource in the company, the impact for the company becomes sustainable. And then becomes, of course, a source of more collaborations, typically with the same university. Do you want to say anything about this? No? I think we've probably said enough.
I just want to make one point.
Sure.
One point from the University of Plymouth recently is that in many senses small companies say, well, we don't need to have graduate level people employed. And having gone through some of these programs, they've actually now begun to find that the companies are actually increasing their capability and are now wanting to take in graduates. So it's a kind of escalator that the companies get on once they feel very confident that they can work with the university. So just to emphasize that program.
It emphasizes the importance in the early stages of providing this brokerage of the product, not just an introduction process. We have seen companies go through things like the Knowledge Transfer Partnership Program who have become self-sufficient then in dealing with universities and have started sponsoring PhDs. I'm actually the project I'm working on at the moment, a successful project concluded a number of years ago, is now sponsoring 5 PhDs in the same university and has sponsored a professor's chair in that university. So it's an indication of how that kind of relationship can grow.
And I think really just on this final slide is, for small companies, cost is a major issue. But as you've seen, looking at the products in the UK, the KTP, okay, it is not cheap, but 60% of that might be funded by grant. The EU is very conscious and looking at, and I mean, this program is a fantastic example of the ability to use European finance to really help bridge these gaps. And there's just more and more of this on the EU websites. It's just worth looking at that to see what the next programs are coming up, and to be really, really engaged with your local programs, local intermediaries. So I'd like to thank you for your attention, and we'd be delighted to take any questions. Thank you.
I begin with a question. The KTP program support SMEs, but which one? I mean, does it supply a grant to a French company hosting an English student?
It's a UK-only program. There may be ways of, there certainly are ways of using the model outside the UK, because we've taken it to the Czech Republic. And in the African Knowledge Transfer Partnership Programme, it also involves support from UK universities. Now, the Technology Strategy Board are working on an international variant of it at the moment. So watch this space. If you really wanted to use it in France, the best route to go is probably the European Union to get funding for it. And of course, we'd be delighted to help you set it up.
Maybe we can ask Mike Entwistle, who is in charge of student placement in KARIM. I think it's a kind of continuation of this, and we try to experiment this notion of placing students from UK in French or German SMEs. And Mike, would you like to say a word about this activity in KARIM?
Yeah, at the moment in KARIM we have a relatively small amount of money to be able to send students from one partner country to another for periods at the moment really of between 5 weeks and 6 months. But that tends to be embedded into either a MSc course or an undergraduate course. But we don't have the capability to run KTPs at the moment, but obviously that would be a fabulous next step if we could do that.
Because,
absolutely.
And perhaps engage with Debbie Buckley Golder and Technology Strategy Board to find out if she'd be interested in perhaps going to Europe to get some money for it.
Right. Yeah, we'll be up for that.
Yeah, I have one comment. I'm speaking for myself, and maybe it's not relevant to the UK, in which case you're very lucky. But I think speaking for my company in interaction with French universities, one of the big hurdles and one of the big stoppers is the bureaucracy that you're up against. It's very easy to get access to researchers and to talk to researchers and get interesting ideas and share interesting projects, which is also why you see your 30% of ideas being incorporated into products. But then if you want to formalize that and you go to the technology transfer people who have a very different meaning to the word time than companies normally do, and who have a very difficulty understanding business, you get very discouraged. And I think it's something that's really very key and very important for small companies to be able to interact with universities. University IP transfer officers or whatever need to understand business better.
Well, I'll take one part. I'm afraid this exists in the UK also. and actually, personally, I came into this world in the mid-90s. And I blame Silicon Valley for all these problems because the UK adopted a tech transfer approach. They thought it was all about licensing technology, and they thought it was all about lawyers and getting bureaucracy into it. We've moved a long way in the UK since then, but it's still not perfect. And the challenge of time and cost and all of that for small companies is very, very real. I think not sure anywhere has entirely cracked it, but maybe I'd like to hand to one of my business development colleagues from Lancaster to say how they're cracking some of this. Nobody's standing up to the plate.
Well, I'll challenge them again in a moment, but yeah, the small companies don't have time. I've run 2 small companies in the past, and at least 95% of my time was spent worrying about how to make the monthly payroll. Yeah. And that's a reality of life. You don't have time to go through long negotiations. One of the reasons that I think the Knowledge Transfer Partnership program works very well with SMEs, it's not limited to SMEs, but over 70% of the projects are with SMEs, is because it de-emphasizes a focus on technology. It puts the emphasis on knowledge. Now, if there is IP created in a program, in a project, we expect there to be an agreement about that, but it's not the main issue around the project. And the universities have become, and indeed the external supporters, the KTP advisors, have become adept at actually keeping the technology transfer office out of it. They've got specialists in the university that deal with KTPs very often. The other thing that's happened in the UK is that there was a thing called the Lambert Agreement, or the Lambert Report. Now, what the Lambert Report did, Richard Lambert, who had just finished being the editor of the Financial Times, published a report, and he said, negotiations with universities are a problem. We need to sit down and look at some standard model agreements. Now, I was actually on the outer group of the observers, if you like, of the inner group that put those agreements together. The discussions that went on in the room were very, very interesting. We didn't hear much about them, but I think there was a lot of blood spilt when the universities and companies started sitting down together. However, the fact that they did produce 5 agreed model agreements that said these are acceptable balances of the right to publish and the right to intellectual property, depending on the amount of financial support you're getting from the company. And those agreements are used to a greater or lesser extent. What I think was most important was the common understanding reached inside the room between some very, very heavy business leaders, Rolls-Royce, GSK, who were significant in putting those agreements together. It was the understanding that was reached that was valuable, and that has actually changed the landscape. Sorry?
Well, just to reiterate that, the Lambert process droned on for a long time in the UK, but what it did was create a focus for engagement and debate and discussion, and I know that colleagues in Canada have been very keen, not so much to adopt the models, but to actually go through the same process. So, you know, what you're facing here, wherever, is exactly the same, all around the world, actually. And when we did that 4-nation study, the UK, Canada, US, and Japan, we found that actually companies were saying the same to us in the US, where most people would think, oh, well, the US has got it sorted. It hadn't, and some of the bureaucracy in the US was even worse than the things we were finding in say, the UK or Canada. So unfortunately, it's not solved, but there
are ways of reaching for a solution.
There is another question coming from an academic.
I'm speaking from France. I would say that the half of my INR program, actually, which has a fund from the state, contains small enterprise, and of course, and it is a plus for the consortium. Usually, there are 2 or 3 academic plus 1 SME, and it is always a plus for everybody. We take usually 2 or 3 months to write the consortium, the rights, and so on, but I don't see too much problem, and I think it works.
Well, that's actually gratifying to know. The fact that working with an SME is a plus, is really regarded as a plus, is actually quite interesting, and it is significant. There's a fund in the UK called the Higher Education Innovation Fund, or HIFE, and income from projects with small companies counts double to the university's credit when it comes to evaluating how that money is spent. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, it's just a fit-in linking those two things, and in fact, harking back to the other question as well. The whole idea of technology and knowledge transfer, when I come into a university and I hear about that, I turn my back and I walk out again, because that's not what's happening. If you're in a high-tech startup, it's state-of-the-art. You go into the university, they're learning. The knowledge is going the other way. But it's also coming from the university. It's coming both directions. So there's a synergy. And in fact, I find the collaborations work well when both parties are excited about the prospects of the synergy. The A&R projects are a great example because you don't really deal with the technology transfer. There's a standard kind of consortium agreement and you get around the problem. But it's really based on a preliminary contact between researchers who like to work together and also with the companies who like to work together. And this idea that the university sells knowledge, sells technology to companies for money, patents in that domain and sells it, is terrible. We've had the experience of going to universities, telling them what we work on, explaining things to them, giving them publications. They weren't in the field. They put a patent down in our field and try and sell it to us. That's unbelievable. That's just blocking the development of industry. So that whole concept of knowledge and technology transfer is very tricky. And some researchers have stopped collaborating by that, and some of them are much freer. So it's actually, I think it hinders collaboration.
Yeah,
I think you're absolutely spot on. I mean, you've highlighted where the initial connections come from. They come in a high-tech context. They come from yourself to an academic. I think this. I just can't say it enough. The paradigm that we I could name names, I better not, but politicians from the UK went across to Silicon Valley and saw what they thought was the model. It applied to biotech and it applied to silicon chips. It didn't apply to the rest of the way that universities work. And the universities in the UK were driven into patenting, licensing, spin-out companies, and that's what they were measured on. And that will take a bit of inertia to get out of that. And what we found again in that multi-country study was that companies were very good at getting round the back door and just avoiding that formality stuff.
Just to come back to that, if you're in the high-tech field, it's a worldwide thing, and universities tend not to have a monopoly on knowledge. I mean, usually researchers are desperate to publish their most advanced knowledge, and you can just download it and read the paper. And if they don't want to work with you, you go to someone else who does. So trying to sell that to you actually stops them collaborating somehow. It's a worldwide market.
Yeah, and I ran a biosensor company in the late 90s for the University of Manchester. Our first collaboration was with another company in Oregon, in Portland, Oregon. And we were in Manchester in the UK. And yeah, in terms of where the university research often is, if you look at software engineering, typically, as well, companies are miles, streets ahead of universities in doing that. In the digital field, they very often are. In digital new media, the universities are still training students on technology that's 3 years out of date compared with where most companies are.
Just to speak up for the universities, what you do get is lots of bright people, lots of lateral thinking, and that two-way exchange is really what you want to cultivate. You know, and I think trying to get out of this knowledge transfer, technology transfer, and get into, you know, collaborative partnership working is where it really happens. So it takes a while to change, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. For a question of time, we have to conclude. Chris Allroyd, maybe we'll make a short conclusion on this relation with the universities.
I've got a microphone. Yes, I'd just like to say we can be quite flexible in terms of what we do on intellectual property. You know, if a project is about developing a company's idea, it's quite easy to declare that there's background intellectual property that the company is bringing to the project, and therefore the intellectual property should, at the end of the project, remain with the company. if there's input from both sides, it's quite possible to again have a situation where the intellectual property flows to the company and perhaps the academic benefits in terms of sharing in the exploitation of that. But you know, we're not after a situation where the intellectual property remains with the university, because universities don't normally exploit it. It's companies that exploit it. So it's actually in our benefit for the intellectual property to go to the company, and then it's just a case of, you know, do we or don't we share in the revenue that it generates.
Final word. Actually, working with companies produces better patents as well. I once interviewed Ian Norton, who was one of the two chief scientists, the other chief scientist from Unilever. He was a guy that dealt with food. And he said, university intellectual property, I never licensed a piece of university-only developed intellectual property that was shown to me. I used to get lots of them. It never took me longer than 2 weeks to break a patent that I got from a university. And if it took me 2 weeks to break it, so would Procter & Gamble. So what use was it to me?
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Kathy and Philip. And now it's time to conclude and present you two last things about KARIM project.
Yes, just a few words of conclusion, and thank you very much, Kathy and Philip, for this training session and this discussion. And we would like also to thank all speakers, KARIM partners, and also the whole Paris Regional Innovation Center team for organizing this very lively event, and Thomas and also Geraldine very much for organizing this event. Before we leave the room, and Thomas will give you some information about lunch, I just want to remind you that if you are interested to review this session, this will be available online on KARIM Network in April, hopefully, very soon. I think this is really a starting point for this networking, so please take the opportunity of the lunch to continue a discussion. And also KARIM is continuing, so there will be other opportunities for meetings and discussion. Just a few words, but you've got that in your binder, in your folder. You're kindly invited to, if you want to carry on following what KARIM can propose you, to participate in the network, to register on the website. Just a very few quick information about the next open forums. There is 2 open forums in Dublin for the current year, on environmental solutions for water and the first one, yeah, the previous one. Thank you. And also one on nanobioscience engineering attached to the biointerface 2012 conference or official. These are for the networking events, and we also have innovation funding events, as I said earlier, in Heidelberg in Paris. And this is also thematic events. So if you are interested in finding new funding on cloud computing, new energy systems, or health technologies, please check the date. And I think that's all for me. Thank you very much for your participation in this event.
So here are some practical tips. Before leaving, please leave your headphones on the table before the exit. And very important for any European project, please fill in the feedback form and leave it before you leave. It's very important for us. And then I remind you to pay attention to the colors of the badges. Network and lunch is happening very close from here. It's about, you see, very simple to find. Please follow the guides on the way to the address. Thank you very much.